King Aella of Northumbria thought he had ended the Viking threat by throwing Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of snakes. He was wrong. Years later, Ragnar's sons came back with the largest Viking army England had ever seen. And when they captured King Aella, they did not execute him quickly. They performed a ritual so brutal that historians still argue about whether it was real. They carved open his back, separated his ribs from his spine, pulled his lungs out through the opening, still breathing, and spread them across his back like wings. They called it the Blood Eagle. The man who designed that punishment was not the biggest of Ragnar's sons, not the strongest. He couldn't even walk. His name was Ivar, and he was the most terrifying of them all. Before we go further, the name. Ivar the Boneless. What did it actually mean? Historians have argued about this for centuries, and there is still no consensus. Theory 1, he had a condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, which would have made his bones fragile and his limbs difficult to control, requiring him to be carried into battle on a shield by his warriors. Theory 2, boneless was a Norse kenning, a poetic metaphor, meaning impotent or without heirs, referring to his inability or choice not to father children. Theory 3, and some scholars prefer this one, boneless referred to extraordinary physical flexibility, making him an exceptional wrestler and fighter despite his size. What every source agrees on is this: whatever his body could or could not do, it did not stop him. If anything, it made him more dangerous. A man who cannot rely on physical strength learns very quickly to rely on something else entirely. Ivar was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok and his second wife Aslaug, herself a figure of legend, the daughter of the heroes Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhilda. When Ragnar returned from raiding and wanted to sleep with Aslaug immediately, she warned him to wait, that their child would be born monstrous if he didn't. Ragnar, being Ragnar, didn't wait. Ivar was born with what the sagas called bones like cartilage, soft, bent, wrong. Aslaug's prophecy had come true. But here is what the sagas also say. From the moment Ivar was old enough to think, he thought differently from every person around him. While his brothers trained their bodies, Ivar trained his mind. He studied enemies. He read people. He understood that information, knowing what someone feared, what they wanted, what they would sacrifice, was worth more than any sword arm. He was a dark psychologist before the term existed. When Ragnar died in King Aella's snake pit, his sons assembled the great heathen army. Every source agrees it was enormous, the largest Viking force ever to land on English soil. What the sources also agree on is who actually led it in the field. Not Bjorn, despite his size and reputation. Not Halfdan, despite his ferocity. Ivar, the man who couldn't walk, was the general. He planned the routes. He chose the targets. He managed the politics of holding together an alliance of Viking chieftains, a notoriously impossible task, through a combination of respect, fear, and the kind of strategic clarity that made every man in the army feel they were following someone who would win. They invaded in 865. Within 2 years they had taken York, the second largest city in England, and dismantled the kingdom of Northumbria entirely. Here is what made Ivar genuinely different from every other Viking commander of his era, and what makes him endlessly fascinating from a psychological standpoint. He understood that the most efficient weapon was not fire or steel, it was reputation. A city that surrenders without fighting costs you nothing. A city that has heard what happens to cities that don't surrender is a city that opens its gates before you arrive. Ivar cultivated his reputation with the same deliberateness that other men cultivated their sword skills. Every act of brutality he committed served a strategic purpose. The Blood Eagle of King Aella was not rage. It was a message delivered to every king in England simultaneously. This is what happens when you kill a Ragnarsson. And the message was received. Ivar didn't win England with the great heathen army alone. He won it with the idea of the great heathen army, and the fear of what it did to those who resisted, the Blood Eagle. We have to talk about it directly, because it sits at the center of everything Ivar represents, and because historians cannot agree on whether it was real. The ritual, as described in the Norse sagas, involved making incisions along the spine of a living victim, breaking the ribs away from the backbone one by one, and pulling the lungs out through the opening to create the appearance of wings, while the victim was still alive. Some historians believe this was a real ritual sacrifice, an offering to Odin, the highest possible honor in Viking belief, which makes the horror even more layered. Ivar may have believed he was giving Eila a warrior's death, not a shameful one. Other historians believe it was invented, a story told afterward to cement the legend. What we know for certain is that Eila died, that Ivar ordered it, and that the story spread across England faster than any army could march. Whether the Blood Eagle was real or legend, it did exactly what Ivar needed it to do. It made every king in England afraid of his name before they ever saw his face. After the conquest of Northumbria, Ivar did something that revealed the full scope of his ambition. He left England and sailed to Ireland. In 870, alongside his brother Olaf the White, Ivar besieged and captured Dumbarton Rock, one of the most fortified strongholds in Britain, after a 4-month siege. He then established himself as King of Dublin, building what would become one of the most powerful Viking settlements in the Western world. The Uí Aimar, the dynasty he founded, would rule Dublin and control much of Ireland and northern Britain for generations after his death. Ivar didn't just want vengeance for his father, he wanted to build something that lasted. The man the sagas called Boneless built a dynasty that endured for over a century. What does Ivar the Boneless teach us about power, stripped of the Viking mythology and the dramatic deaths? He teaches us that physical limitation has never been the real barrier to dominance, that the people who are most dangerous are often the ones who were forced early to develop the skills that brute force never requires: patience, observation, the ability to read people, and the willingness to use what they find. Ivar could not overpower his enemies, so he outthought them, outweighted them, and made sure the story of what he did to those who resisted spread faster than his army could march. Every leader who has ever built power through reputation rather than force, through making an example rather than fighting every battle, is working from a playbook Ivar wrote in blood on the shores of Northumbria over 1,000 years ago. Ivar the Boneless died around 873. The sources are vague on exactly how, which is itself remarkable. The man responsible for some of the most documented brutality in Viking history died quietly enough that no one recorded the details. He left no confirmed children, supporting the kenning theory of his name. What he left instead was a dynasty, the Uí Aimar, whose descendants would rule Dublin for over 100 years, and whose influence shaped the history of Ireland, Scotland and northern England long after the Viking Age itself ended. Ragnar Lothbrok's legacy was his sons. Ivar's legacy was the system he built, the proof that a man defined by what he could not do physically had constructed something more durable than any of the men who could. Ivar the Boneless, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, general of the great heathen army, king of Dublin, founder of a dynasty, a man the sagas said couldn't walk, who reshaped the map of England and Ireland through pure psychological dominance and ruthless strategic intelligence. The dark psychology lesson of Ivar is not complicated. It is simply this: the most dangerous person in any room is rarely the strongest one. It is the one who has spent their whole life learning to win without relying on strength. Ivar had no choice but to learn that lesson early, and he never forgot it. If you've been following our Viking Kings series, the link to Ragnar Lothbrok's full story is above. And if you want to see how Ivar's invasion of England ultimately played out, what his brothers did after he left, subscribe to Powerlines Pod. New episodes every week. And tell me in the comments, was the Blood Eagle real? Because that argument has been going on for 1,000 years, and I want to know where you land.